Imagine it, the year is 410 AD. The great city of Rome, once the beating heart of the world, lies in ruins. Flames lick the night sky as terrified citizens scatter through the streets. For centuries, Rome had stood untouchable, the eternal city, the capital of the mightiest empire the world had ever known. And yet here it was, being sacked by invading Visigoths. How does something so powerful, so dominant, collapse into chaos? That's the story we're going to explore today, the rise and the fall of the Roman Empire. And if you love history brought to life like this, make sure to subscribe to the channel and hit the like button. It helps more people discover these stories. But to truly understand how Rome fell, we need to start at the very beginning, at the legends, the myths, and the humble roots of a city that would one day command the known world. According to Roman legend, Rome was born out of violence, rivalry, and fate. Two brothers, Romulus and Remus, were said to be abandoned as infants, left to die by the river Tiber. But instead of perishing, they were rescued by a she-wolf. Nursed and raised by this wild animal, the boys grew strong, fierce, and ambitious. As men, they decided to found a city. But when a bitter dispute broke out over who should rule it, Romulus struck down his brother Remus in cold blood. He became the first king of Rome, naming the city after himself. Was this story true? Almost certainly not. But it carried a powerful message. Rome was destined to rise from conflict, to survive through struggle, and to grow from the blood of its enemies. In reality, Rome's beginnings were much humbler. Around 753 BC, small villages clustered on the hills of central Italy. They weren't kings and conquerors yet, just farmers and shepherds. But Rome's location was perfect. The fertile land around the Tiber River, its central position on the Italian peninsula, and its defensible hills made it a natural gathering place for trade, commerce, and, eventually, ambition. At first, Rome was ruled by kings. 7 of them, according to tradition, presided over the early city. They laid the foundations of Roman religion, Roman law, and Roman culture. But by around 509 BC, the people of Rome had had enough. The monarchy was overthrown, and from its ashes rose something far more revolutionary, the Roman Republic. The Republic was a bold experiment. Instead of kings, Rome was governed by elected officials, advised by a senate made up of the wealthiest and most powerful citizens. There were checks and balances, rules and traditions, all designed to prevent any one man from seizing too much power. At least that was the theory. In practice, Roman politics was brutal. Deals were made in the shadows. Wealth determined influence. And ordinary citizens often found themselves caught between promises and betrayal. Yet for all its flaws, the Republic gave Rome something no monarchy could: adaptability. Rome was restless. It was hungry. And soon it began to expand. First, the Romans consolidated their hold over Italy. Through a mixture of alliances, treaties, and wars, they slowly absorbed neighboring tribes and cities. Unlike many ancient empires, Rome often offered conquered peoples a path to citizenship, binding them to the Roman system, rather than leaving them as permanent outsiders. This clever strategy transformed enemies into allies, and allies into Romans. Still, Rome was never free from conflict. Its armies were constantly on campaign, defending borders, quelling rebellions, and fighting rivals. And as Rome grew, so did its appetite for power. But all empires face rivals. And for Rome, the greatest early rival was a powerful city across the sea, Carthage. Carthage was wealthy, ambitious, and commanded one of the most formidable navies in the world. Rome and Carthage were destined to clash, and when they did, the struggle would shake the ancient Mediterranean. But before we get there, let's pause. Because what began as a cluster of huts on 7 hills was, in just a few centuries, transforming into a force that would conquer nations. Rome's story was only beginning. The myths had given way to reality. The kings were gone. The Republic was rising. And the stage was set for a conflict that would define the destiny of the empire. From the blood of brothers, from the struggles of farmers and warriors, a city was born. And that city would one day rule the world. In our next chapter, we'll dive into Rome's republic, its structure, its wars, and its victories. We'll see how Rome defeated its enemies at home and began its march toward global dominance. But with power comes temptation, and with victory comes division. The seeds of Rome's eventual downfall were already being planted. Stay with us. But what exactly was this republic? How did it work? And how did a government designed to avoid tyranny set Rome on the path to becoming an empire itself? When Rome cast off its kings around 509 BC, it wasn't just a rebellion, it was a revolution. The Romans didn't want to replace one monarch with another. No, they wanted a system that would keep absolute power out of the hands of any single man. And so, the Roman Republic was born. The Republic was built on a delicate balance. 2 consuls were elected every year to act as Rome's leaders, but their powers were limited, and they could veto each other. The Senate, made up of Rome's aristocrats, the patricians, held enormous sway over policy, finances, and foreign affairs. Meanwhile, the common people, the plebeians, pushed for their own rights, gradually winning political representation through the office of the tribune. It wasn't democracy as we know it today, but it was radical for its time. Rome had created a system that blended monarchy, aristocracy, and democracy all in one. And it worked, at least well enough to turn Rome into a rising force. But make no mistake, the Republic was not a peaceful experiment in governance. From the very beginning, Rome was a state at war. The Italian peninsula was crowded with rival peoples, the Etruscans to the north, the Samnites in the mountains, Greek colonies along the southern coast. Rome had to fight and fight constantly to survive. And fight they did. Rome's legions, citizen soldiers, disciplined and organized, proved more resilient than their enemies expected. Defeats did not break Rome. In fact, defeats often made Rome stronger, forcing the Republic to adapt, reorganize, and come back with even greater force. This resilience became the hallmark of Roman warfare. One by one, Rome's Italian rivals were brought to heel. But here's where Rome did something clever, something that would set it apart from so many other ancient powers. Instead of simply crushing their enemies, the Romans often offered them a deal: loyalty in exchange for protection, rights, and even the possibility of Roman citizenship. Imagine that. Your city gets conquered, but instead of being permanently subjugated, you're told, "Fight with us, and in time, you can become one of us." This policy of inclusion, of turning enemies into allies, allowed Rome to expand its manpower and secure its dominance across Italy. By the early 3rd century BC, Rome was the master of the peninsula. But Rome's ambitions didn't stop at Italy's borders. Beyond the sea, another power loomed: Carthage. Carthage was a wealthy trading empire based in North Africa, near modern-day Tunisia. Its fleets controlled the western Mediterranean. Its merchants grew rich on commerce. And its armies, bolstered by mercenaries, were formidable. When Rome's expanding influence clashed with Carthage's dominance, the result was inevitable: war. The Punic Wars. 3 brutal conflicts, stretching over a century, that would decide the fate of the Mediterranean world. The First Punic War began in 264 BC, over control of Sicily. It was a clash of land power versus naval power. Rome, with little naval experience, built a fleet almost from scratch. Through grit, innovation, and sheer stubbornness, the Romans managed to defeat Carthage and claim Sicily as their first overseas province. Victory tasted sweet. But Carthage was not finished. In the Second Punic War, Carthage unleashed one of history's greatest military commanders, Hannibal Barca. Hannibal's strategy was audacious. Instead of attacking Rome directly from the sea, he led his army, complete with war elephants, on a daring march across Spain, over the towering Alps, and into the heart of Italy. For years, Hannibal terrorized the Roman countryside. At the Battle of Cannae in 216 BC, he delivered Rome one of its most devastating defeats, slaughtering tens of thousands of Roman soldiers in a single day. Rome seemed on the brink of collapse. But Rome did not yield. While Hannibal rampaged through Italy, Rome adapted. They refused to give him the decisive battle he wanted. Instead, they wore him down, cutting off his supply lines, attacking Carthaginian holdings elsewhere. Finally, under the leadership of General Scipio Africanus, Rome struck back, invading North Africa itself. At the Battle of Zama in 202 BC, Hannibal was defeated. Carthage was forced into submission, stripped of power, and left a shadow of its former self. The Roman Republic was now the dominant power of the Western Mediterranean. But victories come at a price. With each new conquest, Rome grew wealthier, yes, but also more unequal. Vast fortunes poured into the city, enriching the elite, while ordinary citizens often struggled. Slaves captured in war flooded the markets, displacing free laborers. And ambitious generals began to realize that loyalty could be bought, not just from the Senate, but from the soldiers who fought for them. The Republic was rising. Its reach was spreading far beyond Italy. But the cracks were starting to show. Rome had defeated Carthage. It had become the unrivaled superpower of the Mediterranean. But power is a dangerous prize. And soon, men like Julius Caesar would rise, not just to defend the Republic, but to challenge it. In our next chapter, we'll explore the unraveling of the Republic, how corruption, ambition, and civil war tore apart Rome's political system and paved the way for emperors. Rome had defeated Carthage. It was the unrivaled superpower of the Mediterranean. But with victory came wealth, and with wealth came corruption. The Republic was stronger than ever on the outside, yet inside, the cracks were widening. The wars had changed Rome. Conquests brought in rivers of gold, grain, and slaves, but not everyone shared in the prosperity. The Senate, dominated by wealthy patricians, grew richer and more arrogant, while ordinary citizens struggled with poverty and debt. Veteran soldiers, once farmers, often returned home to find their land seized by the elite. Some were left with nothing. Inequality was becoming Rome's new enemy. And into this growing divide stepped ambitious men, generals who realized that the loyalty of their soldiers might be more powerful than the authority of the Senate. The first cracks appeared with men like Gaius Marius and Lucius Cornelius Sulla. Marius, a brilliant general, broke tradition by recruiting landless citizens into the legions, promising them land and wealth in return for service. His soldiers weren't just fighting for Rome anymore, they were fighting for him. Sulla followed a similar path, using his army to seize political power. Civil war erupted. For the first time, Roman legions marched on Rome itself. The Republic had survived, but the precedent was set. If a general had the loyalty of his troops, he could defy the state itself. And then came Julius Caesar. Caesar was ambitious, charismatic, and dangerously brilliant. Born into a patrician family but skilled at winning popular support, he rose quickly through Rome's political ranks. As governor of Gaul, he proved himself a military genius, conquering vast territories, crushing rivals, and writing reports of his victories that captured the imagination of the Roman people. His soldiers adored him. The masses cheered his name. But in the Senate, his growing power was seen as a threat. The Senate ordered Caesar to disband his army and return to Rome as a private citizen. To comply would mean the end of his career, and perhaps his life. To refuse would mean civil war. Standing on the banks of the Rubicon River in 49 BC, Caesar made his choice. With his army at his back, he crossed the river declaring Alia iacta est, the die is cast. The Republic would never be the same. Civil war engulfed Rome once again. Caesar faced off against Pompey, once his ally, now his rival. After a series of battles across Greece, Egypt, and Spain, Caesar emerged victorious. He was now the undisputed ruler of Rome. At first, Caesar ruled with care. He introduced reforms, expanded citizenship, and tried to reduce inequality. But his growing power alarmed the Senate. He was named dictator for life, a title that echoed too closely the monarchy Rome had overthrown centuries earlier. And in the shadows, conspirators whispered. On the Ides of March, 44 BC, Julius Caesar entered the Senate. Surrounded by men he thought were allies, he was attacked. Blades flashed. Stab after stab struck his body. According to legend, when Caesar saw Brutus among the assassins, he gasped, "Et tu, Brute, you too, Brutus." The great general fell, his lifeblood soaking the Senate floor. The Republic had killed its would-be king. But the conspirators had miscalculated. Instead of restoring the Republic, Caesar's murder plunged Rome into deeper chaos. Civil wars flared again, this time between Caesar's supporters and his assassins. From this chaos emerged Caesar's adopted heir, Octavian, soon to be known as Augustus. The Republic, wounded beyond repair, was breathing its last. A new order was rising, an empire ruled not by the Senate but by emperors. Rome had outgrown its republic. What began as a bold experiment in shared power had crumbled under ambition, inequality, and endless civil war. The age of emperors was about to begin. The republic was dead. The Senate still sat in its marble halls, but its authority was hollow. Power no longer rested in the hands of elected officials. It now belonged to a single man. And that man was Augustus. Octavian, Caesar's adopted heir, was only 19 when his great-uncle was assassinated. Few expected him to survive in the brutal arena of Roman politics. But he was shrewd, patient, and utterly determined. Aligning himself first with Caesar's allies, then turning on them when the time was right, Octavian defeated all rivals. In 31 BC, at the Battle of Actium, he crushed Mark Antony and Cleopatra, seizing control of Rome once and for all. 2 years later, the Senate gave him a new name, Augustus. He would become Rome's first emperor. With Augustus began a new chapter, the Roman Empire. Augustus was careful not to call himself king. Instead, he styled himself as the princeps, the first citizen. But make no mistake, he held absolute power. The legions swore loyalty to him. The Senate followed his lead. Rome had traded the chaos of civil war for the stability of one man's rule. And stability is what Augustus delivered. Under his leadership, Rome entered a golden age known as the Pax Romana, the Roman peace. For more than 2 centuries, the empire enjoyed relative stability and prosperity. Roads stretched thousands of miles, connecting cities and provinces. Aqueducts carried fresh water into bustling urban centers. The Colosseum rose as a monument to Roman engineering and Roman spectacle. In the provinces, local cultures blended with Roman law, language, and architecture. To be Roman was no longer about living in Rome itself. It was about belonging to a vast civilization that stretched from the deserts of Egypt to the cold frontiers of Britain. Picture it, merchants carrying silk from China and spices from India, unloading their goods at Roman ports. Farmers in North Africa shipping grain to feed millions in the capital. Soldiers guarding the frozen rivers of Germany or the sun-scorched sands of Syria. All roads, quite literally, led to Rome. But beneath the glory, cracks remained. Emperors came and went, some wise and capable, others cruel and unstable. After Augustus, emperors like Tiberius, Caligula, and Nero reminded the world that absolute power could be dangerous. Caligula became infamous for his madness, while Nero is remembered for extravagance and for a city consumed by fire during his reign. Yet Rome endured. The empire was bigger than any one man. The 2nd century brought some of Rome's greatest rulers, the so-called 5 good emperors. Men like Trajan, who expanded the empire to its greatest territorial extent, and Hadrian, who built the famous wall in Britain to mark Rome's northern frontier. Marcus Aurelius, the philosopher emperor, ruled with wisdom and left behind meditations still read today. This was Rome at its height, its roads busy with trade, its cities humming with life, its legions feared across the world. But prosperity can breed complacency. The wealth of empire masked the difficulties of managing such vast lands. Maintaining borders demanded endless resources. Armies stationed at the frontiers grew restless. And in the heart of Rome, political intrigue never ceased. The empire was strong but fragile. The Pax Romana would not last forever. Economic troubles, political instability, and new religions would begin to reshape Rome. And on the horizon, beyond the empire's borders, new enemies were gathering strength. Rome stood at its peak, but the seeds of decline had already been sown. At its height, Rome was a marvel, an empire of roads, cities, armies, and laws that bound together millions of people. But even at its strongest, the empire was already straining under its own weight. The fall of Rome was not sudden. It began from within. Economics were the first warning signs. Maintaining a vast empire required endless resources, armies to guard the borders, officials to govern the provinces, infrastructure to build and repair. Taxes rose, draining the wealth of farmers and citizens. Inflation devalued currency. Trade routes, once reliable, became harder to secure. Meanwhile, Rome's reliance on slave labor created stagnation. Innovation slowed. Inequality widened. The empire was rich, yes, but its wealth was concentrated in fewer and fewer hands. And then there was politics. Rome's emperors were supposed to bring stability. But more often they brought chaos. Some ruled wisely, but others were disasters. Assassinations, conspiracies, and palace intrigues became common. In one bloody stretch of the 3rd century, more than 20 emperors rose and fell in just 50 years, most dying violently. The empire was no longer united by loyalty. It was divided by ambition. Generals fought each other for the throne. Provinces rebelled. Authority crumbled. And while Rome tore itself apart, a new force was spreading quietly across its lands: Christianity. What began as a small, persecuted sect in Judea grew rapidly, offering hope to the poor and a sense of community that Roman religion lacked. By the early 4th century, Christianity had become a powerful presence. In 313 AD, Emperor Constantine legalized the faith with the Edict of Milan. Later, under Theodosius, Christianity became the official religion of the empire. Pagan temples closed. Old traditions faded. Rome's identity was changing. Its gods abandoned, its culture transformed. For some, this was renewal. For others, it was a sign that Rome itself was fading away. And yet, emperors tried to hold it together. One of the most dramatic attempts came under Diocletian. Realizing that the empire had become too vast to manage alone, Diocletian split it in two: an Eastern Empire and a Western Empire. Each had its own ruler, its own administration, its own capital. For a time, this brought order. The East, centered around Byzantium, later Constantinople, thrived. But the West, with Rome at its heart, struggled. Its economy was weaker, its armies stretched thin, its leaders less capable. And beyond Rome's frontiers, a storm was gathering. The so-called barbarians, Germanic tribes like the Goths, the Vandals, the Franks, were growing restless. Some sought new lands to settle. Others were driven by hunger, war, or pressure from an even fiercer people pushing in from the east: the Huns. Rome had long prided itself on its ability to absorb outsiders. But now the influx was too great, too fast. The empire could no longer control its borders. The legions that had once crushed Carthage and conquered Gaul were no longer invincible. Armies filled with mercenaries, men loyal not to Rome but to whoever paid them, were unreliable. The Western Empire in particular was vulnerable. Cities that had once thrived began to decline. Corruption, instability, and invasion fed on each other. And slowly the Eternal City was being brought to its knees. The decline of Rome was not just the loss of battles. It was the slow unraveling of its identity, its economy, its politics, its culture, its very sense of purpose. The empire was still standing, but the shadows were lengthening. and soon the final blows would fall. By the 4th and 5th centuries, the Western Roman Empire was a shadow of its former self. Once the master of the known world, it now clung desperately to survival. The decline that had begun within was about to be sealed from without. In 376 AD, a mass of Gothic tribes crossed into Roman territory, fleeing from the terrifying advance of the Huns. Rome agreed to let them settle inside the empire's borders, but the arrangement quickly turned sour. Mistreatment, corruption, and broken promises drove the Goths to revolt. 2 years later, in 378, at the Battle of Adrianople, the unthinkable happened. A Roman army was annihilated, and Emperor Valens was killed on the battlefield. Rome had suffered defeats before, but this was different. For the first time, the empire had been decisively beaten by invading tribes within its own lands. The floodgates were open. The Goths, the Vandals, the Huns under their fearsome leader Attila, all pressed into Roman lands. Each invasion weakened the empire further, stripping away provinces, wealth, and pride. And then, in 410 AD, the unthinkable became reality. The city of Rome itself, the Eternal City, was sacked by the Visigoths under Alaric. Citizens wept as their city burned. For centuries, Rome had been the symbol of strength, invincibility, destiny. And now it lay in ruins. Rome would never truly recover. The empire staggered on for a few more decades, but it was only a matter of time. In 476 AD, the final blow fell. The last Western emperor, a boy named Romulus Augustulus, was deposed by the barbarian general Odoacer. The Western Roman Empire was no more. Yet even in its fall, Rome left behind something extraordinary. Its eastern half, the Byzantine Empire, would survive for nearly 1,000 more years. Roman law, architecture, and culture endured, shaping Europe and the wider world. Christianity, once persecuted, became Rome's greatest legacy, spreading far beyond the empire's borders. Rome may have fallen, but it was never truly gone. When we look back at Rome, we see more than just ruins. We see a warning and a lesson. Empires rise on ambition, discipline, and unity. But they fall through corruption, inequality, and complacency. The story of Rome is the story of human civilization itself, fragile, magnificent, fleeting, and eternal.